that would be less efficient than having one firm. Right? So it will often be the case, and we'll study this as well later, that when a market is really small, it may only be able to support one firm. But as the market gets larger, it supports naturally more firms. Victor, Leo, could you give some examples of natural monopolies in practice?
The book talks about utilities.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good example. Electrical utilities, right? Another example is sort of like social or telephone networks. A lot of people think are, natural monopolies. It seems really hard to imagine there being a bunch of different social networks because everyone wants to be interconnected with everybody else. Another example is the monitoring. Yeah.
I was going to ask, did you say professional sports is a natural monopoly?
No, I didn't.
I mean, could you?
Could you? Well, I guess it depends what you mean by that. So a professional sports league is probably a natural monopoly, but each individual team is obviously not a monopoly, right? So to the extent that the league is organized, which is basically what it is now, you could say that they're a monopoly. They're also a monopsony, because basically the workers have nothing to do other than be basketball players. Like the next best job that most top basketball players could get would probably be like washing dishes in a restaurant or something. So another example of monopoly is monitoring income. So I don't know if anyone looked at the solutions to problem set 1, question 2, sort of towards the end, but the government basically owns an equity stake in every citizen, right? They get some chunk of our income, right? And there's a huge amount of economies of scale in doing that. It wouldn't make much sense to have a bunch of different companies that have the job of monitoring your income, because the problem is, like, one of the main ways I make sure that you don't cheat on your income taxes is that I also collect the income taxes from your employer, right? And I can check them against one another to make sure things line up. So it's just much more efficient to be checking everyone's income than it is for different companies to be checking different people's income. Public transportation is a natural monopoly in many settings as well.
Should it be a natural monopoly?
Well, natural monopoly means it should be, right? So I think it's a natural monopoly because the thing is the whole system has to link up with it. It would be quite inefficient to have a bunch of different systems because they couldn't link up very well. Yeah,
This back to the sports argument, you said that clearly the current leagues are monopolies, but are they natural monopolies?
well, I think they might be. I don't know. I mean, I'm not that confident of that conclusion. But it seems like if you had two different, basketball leagues, it might be quite a bit less efficient because you would lose out on the opportunity to have the absolute best people playing the other absolute best people within a given league. And if people value seeing the best people, then there's going to be a natural push to consolidate and have all those people playing against each other in one league.
Do natural monopolies have to be protected to?
No, they don't have to be protected.
Does that ruin it being a natural monopoly because of government, like their antitrust laws?
That help it.
Is that?
Yeah, I mean, the question is, it clearly is a monopoly. It's partly a monopoly because of government policy, possibly, or it might be that it's a natural monopoly and the government policy is redundant. I don't know. It's complicated. I mean, my intuition is it probably has some natural monopoly characteristics, but not as strong as some of these other examples. The simplest solution to monopoly is just to mandate that the firm charge prices equal to marginal cost, right? The problem with this is typically marginal costs are below average costs because there's economies of scale. Like that's the nature of a natural monopoly, is that cost curves are declining, and that means that the marginal cost is below the average cost. And so what that means is that if we want firms to price at marginal cost, which is efficient, we'd have to provide a big subsidy to make sure the firm doesn't lose money. So this requires not just having a regulator in charge, but it requires the government actually supplying the money to make up for the losses made by the firm. And this has to come from taxes that you and I all pay, like income taxes, sales taxes, things like from the last lecture. So we talked about this lump sum redistribution last lecture. Well, one major form that takes is subsidies to natural monopolies so that they can operate at marginal cost prices. It's basically like a public good in that sense. So some examples of that are that public transportation usually makes losses. It charges prices that are close to marginal cost, but they have tons of fixed costs of upgrading the system and stuff like that, and that's just paid by the government. The Postal Service usually makes losses as well. Most government services, like the Department of Motor Vehicles, also make losses. So those are examples of things that you might think of as natural monopolies, where because they charge marginal cost prices, they make losses, and those are funded by the government. So two other ways, other than marginal cost pricing, have been proposed to achieve the optimal solution. One is perfect price discrimination, and Federico, can you remind us why that achieves the ideal, the optimal outcome?
Yes, because the firm would always want to supply everyone who has marginal willingness to pay, or willingness to pay marginal cost, but it can't because it would lose profit on the end for marginal units.
Yeah.
And if it can charge willingness to pay to every single customer, then it could supply everybody who's willing to pay above marginal cost.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, so in practice, that doesn't work, as we talked about last lecture, or the lecture before, but there's lots of things that can get close. Nonlinear pricing, two-part tariffs, high quality, very well done third-degree price discrimination, and if this works well, it's really not that different from sort of an income tax, right? Because you try to figure out what everyone's willing to pay. If that's closely related to their income, you're sort of just charging them something based on their income. So it's actually quite similar to some sort of an income tax. Another possible solution is subsidies in the absence of a price regulation. And Clementina, why could that solve the problem?
What could solve?
Yeah, well, how could subsidies, even if we didn't have like a cap on prices, eliminate the distortions created by a monopoly?
Because it is like the supply, even if I was deciding what the people supply to the states, because they would feel like they would have purchasing power, or if they were subsidies towards the companies, then they would reduce tax.
Yeah, that's right. So the company, basically the problem in a monopoly is that prices are above cost. The consumers create a positive externality for the firm. We can internalize that externality by giving them a subsidy that's equal to the markup, right? And yeah.
In the INAV article, the
Yeah.
insurance one,
Yeah.
it said that another way of solving this would be to mandate every customer to buy insurance, and that would get it
Yeah,
optimal.
that's sort of like cap and trade.
But how would that, I don't understand how that would reach the optimal quantity, because the firms that want to supply it, if you just tell customers you have to buy it.
Well, then that's basically like giving a subsidy, that they're sort of like now being taxed and forced to pay for their insurance. You see what I mean? So you could do a similar thing here. It's sort of like cap and trade, right? Imagine you said to consumers, rather than giving them a subsidy, a certain number of people have to buy the product, and then people would have a tradable commitment to purchase the product, right? So subsidies create the same issue that the marginal cost pricing does, which is that they require general government revenue. And we'll talk some of the issues with that. So the only major difference between regulation and these two types of solutions is the distribution of resources, because under both subsidies and perfect price discrimination, all the things that are needed in order to make things more efficient end up being captured by the monopolist, right? The monopolist gets those subsidies. The monopolist gets to perfectly price discriminate. Whereas under regulation, that money is taken by the public. So in some sense, all these things are the same solution, except there's a question of whether the monopolist or whether the public gets the benefits associated with them. And if you want to take one of these solutions and then transfer the benefits to the public, you can hold an auction for the right to be the monopolist, and then you can use that money to pay for public services. Okay, so the problem is that all of these solutions require a ton of information. So marginal cost regulation requires you to know the entire cost curve, right? It's not enough to know just what the marginal cost is, because that lets you get the right level of prices, but you have to figure out how much of a subsidy to give the firms so they don't go bankrupt. You don't want to give them too much, but you don't want to give them too little, because if you do too little, they'll shut down. If you do too much, then you're just giving away money. And that requires that you know both the average cost and the marginal cost at every point. There's also basically negative incentive under this system to control costs. So anything that doesn't affect your marginal cost, just like wasting money on all types of stuff, even if as long as it has no effect on your marginal cost, won't affect the price. And so you can go and do whatever the hell you want as long as it shows up on your cost. So a classic example of this is like, I don't know if anyone has ever worked for like an investment bank during the summer, but if you start getting like an expense account, right, where like, anything that's a cost to them that's not a marginal cost for you, you just go and get drunk and you charge it to entertainment expense. In fact, we'll see in Margin Call when we go to see that movie, there's this great line where they ask this guy how he spends $1.5 million a year, and he says he spends about $80,000 on hookers, drugs, and alcohol, but then most of that he can expense as a business expense. So it doesn't actually consume much of his income. So marginal cost pricing can give very little incentive to keep costs down. Pigouvian subsidies require knowing a fair bit about demand, right? You don't need to know the whole curve, but you do need to know its slope over a range to know what the firm's optimal markup is, right? Perfect price discrimination requires knowing each person's individual willingness to pay. And even extracting, once you've got Pigouvian subsidies or perfect price discrimination, the value to give back to the public by an auction requires that there are several other competitors who also know what the value of the franchise is. Otherwise, they won't bid aggressively for it. Another really important problem with this type of thing is that once you regulate things down to marginal cost, it's really hard to know whether it was worth creating the thing in the first place. Because the market doesn't tell you that anyone's willing to pay for those average costs, right? At least when prices are at or above average cost, you know that the demand in the market justifies the cost of creating the thing in the first place. Whereas if you charge prices at marginal cost, who knows? It could have just been a totally wasteful thing in the first place. And we'll talk about this a bit on Tuesday, but there's a famous quote from Adam Smith where he says, 250 years before Sarah Palin, that basically the problem with building bridges using the government revenue and then charging marginal cost for them is that then you end up building bridges over rivers that no one ever travels over, right? Because there's no discipline on it that makes sure that it's worth building the bridge in the first place. So another problem is what's called regulatory capture. Regulation can often become a means of corruption. The regulators end up being cozy with those who are regulated. They're easy to control. And just as with licensure that we talked about in the first class, consumers are very diffuse, right? Whereas the regulated firms are very concentrated. And there's some evidence that this happens, but organized consumer groups can sometimes help balance this type of thing. And the worst situations are when things are very opaque, when the industry is very complicated, when it's very hard for consumers to monitor anything. In some sense, this is really just the same as the information problems I was talking about, which is that consumers don't have enough information to really monitor effectively compared to what the people in the industry does. And maybe that pushes back who we want to think about having the information or not having the information one level, but in some sense it's fundamentally an information problem. So the key thing is putting people who have the right incentives and the right information in charge of the system in some way, as we've studied throughout the course. Yeah, Ben?
The last time I was talking about the information problems, and we were talking about how we were trying to build a railroad to go to a hill.
Yep.
We wouldn't know the right price, right?
Yeah.
So is there a way to think about this issue in terms of pricing things and that price revealing information?
Yeah, so the problem is that, as we'll see